I opened my front door that Tuesday morning in suburban Phoenix, Arizona, expecting to find a package, but instead found a certified letter from the Sagebrush Hills Homeowners Association taped right above the doorbell. My coffee mug paused halfway to my lips as I stared at the bright orange envelope with violation notice stamped across it in angry red letters. Nothing good ever came in orange envelopes from the HOA. Tearing it open, I scanned the contents with growing disbelief. According to the letter, I was being fined $500 for failure to maintain the fire hydrant on my property. The notice stated that snow and ice from the recent freak winter storm that had hit Phoenix had not been cleared from around the hydrant within the required 72 hours, creating a public safety hazard. There was a grainy photo attached showing the red hydrant partially obscured by remnants of the unusual snowfall we'd gotten last week. The problem was, I had cleared that hydrant. I remembered it specifically because my neighbor Tom had made a joke about Phoenix getting enough snow to actually require shoveling. I'd cleared my driveway, the sidewalk, and yes, that hydrant near the property line. But more importantly, I was pretty sure that hydrant wasn't even on my property. I walked outside in my slippers, still holding the letter and my coffee. The morning sun was already warming the desert landscape, and all traces of last week's snow had long since melted. I made my way down to the corner of my lot where the hydrant stood, a bright red sentinel that I'd never paid much attention to before. Standing next to it, I looked back at my house, then at the property markers I'd had installed when I bought the place 3 years ago. The hydrant was definitely outside my property line. Not by much, maybe 2 feet, but it was clearly on the strip of common area that the HOA maintained between properties. I pulled out my phone and snapped several photos, making sure to capture the property marker stakes and the hydrant's position relative to them. This was going to be interesting. The Sagebrush Hills HOA was run by a woman named Brenda Patterson, who had made it her life's mission to enforce every single rule in our community's covenant with the zeal of a border patrol agent. She'd fine people for having the wrong shade of beige on their mailboxes, for parking their cars in their own driveways overnight instead of in garages, and for having grass that was a 1/4 inch too tall. I'd managed to avoid her wrath until now, but my luck had apparently run out. I went back inside and called the HOA office. A receptionist answered on the 4th ring. Sagebrush Hills HOA, this is Jennifer speaking. Hi Jennifer, this is Derek Walters from 847 Desert Bloom Drive. I just received a violation notice about a fire hydrant, and I need to speak with someone about it. What's your account number? I found it on the letter and read it off to her. I heard typing on the other end. Okay, I see the violation here. You're being fined for failure to maintain the fire hydrant. The fine is $500, due within 30 days. You can pay online or mail a check to our office. I'm not disputing that the hydrant wasn't cleared properly, I said, keeping my voice level. But the hydrant isn't on my property. It's on HOA common area. There was a pause. The violation notice was issued by our Community Standards Director, Brenda Patterson. All property owners are responsible for maintaining fire hydrants on or adjacent to their property lines. Adjacent to isn't the same as on my property. Can I speak with Brenda? She's not available right now. I can have her call you back. When? Within 3 to 5 business days. I suppressed a groan. Fine, please have her call me. But I want it noted that I'm formally disputing this violation. I'll make a note in your file. I hung up and immediately called my real estate attorney, Phil Morrison. Phil had handled my home purchase and had been a friend since college. He answered on the 2nd ring. Derek, what's going on? I explained the situation, sending him photos while we talked. "So let me get this straight," Phil said after I finished. "They're fining you for a hydrant that's not on your property, and they're citing some rule about property owner responsibility." "That's exactly it." "Do you have your property survey?" "Yeah, from when I bought the place." "Send me that too, along with the violation notice and any HOA rules they're citing." This is probably an easy fix, but knowing HOAs, they're going to make it difficult just because they can. I spent the next hour digging through my files to find the property survey, scanning everything, and emailing it to Phil. Then I went to work, trying to put the whole thing out of my mind. I was a software developer for a tech company downtown, and I had a deadline approaching for a major project. The last thing I needed was HOA drama distracting me. 3 days passed with no call from Brenda Patterson. On Friday afternoon, I called the HOA office again. Sagebrush Hills HOA, Jennifer speaking. "Hi Jennifer, it's Derek Walters again. I was supposed to get a call back from Brenda Patterson." "Let me check." More typing. "I don't see any notes about her calling you. Would you like me to send her another message?" "Yes, please, and can you tell me when she'll be in the office? I'd like to come by in person." "She's usually here Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. But she prefers people to make appointments." "Great. Can I make an appointment for Monday morning?" "Let me see." A long pause. "She has an opening at 10:30. I'll take it." Monday morning arrived, and I dressed in business casual, wanting to look professional but not like I was trying too hard. Phil had reviewed all my documents over the weekend and confirmed what I already knew. The hydrant was definitely not on my property, and according to the HOA's own recorded plat maps, it was on common area maintained by the association itself. The HOA office was located in a small commercial building at the entrance to our subdivision. I arrived at 10:25 and checked in with Jennifer, who looked to be in her early 20s and seemed perpetually overwhelmed by the chaos of the office. Papers were stacked everywhere, and the phone rang constantly. At exactly 10:30, a door opened and Brenda Patterson emerged. She was in her early 50s, with short blonde hair cut in a severe bob, wearing a pantsuit that looked like it cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Her expression was the definition of someone who had never been told no in her entire life. "Mr. Walters," she said, not offering a handshake. "Come in." I followed her into an office that was immaculately organized, the complete opposite of the reception area. Everything had its place, and I got the distinct impression that Brenda knew exactly where every paper clip and staple was located. "I assume you're here about your violation notice," she said, sitting down behind her desk and folding her hands. "I am. The hydrant you're fining me for isn't on my property. The hydrant is adjacent to your property line, and per Section 12.7 of the Community Covenants, property owners are responsible for maintaining clear access to all fire safety equipment on or adjacent to their lots." I pulled out my folder of documents. I have my property survey here, and photos showing that the hydrant is actually on HOA common area, not my property. The covenant says adjacent to. That includes a reasonable area around your property boundaries. How reasonable? Because this is 2 feet outside my property line, on land that the HOA owns and maintains. According to your own plat maps, this is common area. Brenda's expression didn't change. The covenant is clear. Property owners adjacent to fire safety equipment are responsible for maintenance. So, if I'm responsible for maintaining HOA property, do I get a reduction in my HOA fees? That's not how it works. Then I'm not paying the fine. The hydrant isn't my responsibility. Brenda picked up a pen and made a note on a pad. Failure to pay the fine within 30 days will result in additional penalties, including a lien on your property. I'd advise you to reconsider." "I'm not reconsidering. I'm formally disputing this violation, and I'm prepared to take this to arbitration if necessary." "That's your right," Brenda said, her tone suggesting she'd heard it all before and wasn't concerned. "But in the meantime, the fine stands and the clock is ticking." I stood up. "You'll be hearing from my attorney." As I left the office, I heard Brenda call out, "Have a nice day, Mr. Walters." I sat in my car for a few minutes trying to calm down. Then I called Phil. "How'd it go?" he asked. "About as well as expected. She's not budging. Says the covenant makes me responsible for anything adjacent to my property." "I've been looking at that covenant language," Phil said. "It's vague, probably intentionally so. But here's the thing. Arizona law is pretty clear that HOAs can't enforce fees or fines for maintaining property they own. That's double dipping. They collect fees for common area maintenance, so they can't then turn around and make individual owners responsible for specific pieces of that common area. So what do? I'm going to send a formal letter to the HOA board, explaining why the fine is invalid. I'll give them 14 days to rescind it. If they don't, we'll file for arbitration. It might cost you a bit in legal fees, but we'll get them for that too if we win." "Do it," I said. Phil's letter went out the next day via certified mail. I got a copy, and it was beautifully written, citing specific Arizona statutes and case law that supported my position. I felt confident that once the HOA board saw this, they'd back down. I was wrong. 10 days later, I received another letter from the HOA. This one informed me that not only was my original fine still valid, but I was now being fined an additional $250 for failure to respond appropriately to community standards enforcement, and another $500 for creating a contentious environment detrimental to community harmony. I stared at the letter in disbelief. They were now trying to fine me $1,250 total, and the language about contentious environment was clearly retaliation for hiring an attorney. Phil was even more incredulous when I called him. They actually put that in writing. That they're fining you for disputing their fine, word for word. "Derek, this is good for us. They just handed us their heads on a silver platter. This is textbook retaliation, and it's illegal as hell. We're not going to arbitration anymore. We're going straight to court." Over the next 2 weeks, Phil prepared a lawsuit against the Sagebrush Hills HOA, naming both the association and Brenda Patterson personally. We were suing for the fines to be rescinded, for attorney's fees, and for damages based on the illegal retaliation. Phil also filed for an emergency injunction preventing the HOA from placing a lien on my property while the case was pending. The lawsuit was filed in Maricopa County Superior Court on a Tuesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, my phone was ringing off the hook. Apparently word had spread through the neighborhood, and several other homeowners who'd had issues with Brenda and the HOA board wanted to know more. One of these calls was from my neighbor, Marcus Chen, who lived 3 houses down from me. "Derek, is it true you're suing the HOA?" he asked. "Yeah, it's true. Good, I want in." "What happened to you?" "They fined me for having a garden gnome in my front yard. Said it violated the tasteful decoration standards. It was a 6-inch gnome next to my roses. They hit me with a $300 fine, and when I fought it, they added more fines just like they did to you." "How much total?" $800. "I paid it because I was worried about them putting a lien on my house, but I want that money back." I gave Marcus Phil's contact information, and by the end of the week, Phil had 5 more clients with similar stories of ridiculous fines and retaliatory penalties. What had started as my personal dispute was turning into a potential class action lawsuit. The HOA's attorney, a guy named Richard Sorensen from a big Phoenix firm, reached out to Phil to discuss settlement. They met without me present, and Phil called me afterward. "They want to settle," he said. "They'll rescind all your fines and pay your attorney's fees if you agree to drop the lawsuit." "What about everyone else?" "They didn't mention anyone else. This offer is just for you." "No deal," I said immediately. "If we settle, it has to include everyone they've done this to, and there needs to be reforms in how they issue fines going forward." "That's what I told them you'd say. Just wanted to confirm." "What did they say?" "Sorensen said he'd talk to his clients and get back to me." "But Derek, I need you to understand something. If we turn down a reasonable settlement and then lose at trial, you could be on the hook for their attorney's fees too. This could get expensive." "I understand, but this isn't just about money anymore. Brenda Patterson has been bullying people in this neighborhood for years, and someone needs to stop her." Phil was quiet for a moment. "Okay, just wanted to make sure you knew what you're getting into." The next development came from an unexpected source. A reporter named Sarah Kim from the Arizona Republic called me one evening. Someone had tipped her off about the lawsuit, and she wanted to do a story about HOA abuse. "I've been covering HOA issues for a few years now," she explained. "Arizona has some of the most powerful HOAs in the country and some of the weakest homeowner protections. Your case sounds like a perfect example of what can go wrong." I agreed to an interview, and the story ran the following Sunday on the front page of the local section. It was titled, "Phoenix Man Fights Back Against HOA Over Fire Hydrant Fine," and it included interviews with me, Marcus, and two other homeowners who'd been hit with questionable fines. The article also included some damning information Sarah had dug up. Brenda Patterson had been the Community Standards Director for 3 years, and during that time, the HOA's fine revenue had increased by 400%. "Fine revenue," I said to Phil when I read that part. "They're treating fines like a profit center. Looks that way. And that's another problem for them. HOAs are supposed to be non-profit organizations. If they're generating significant revenue from fines, especially questionable fines, that could be a whole separate legal issue." The article generated a lot of attention. My phone rang constantly with calls from other HOA victims, not just in Sagebrush Hills but from communities all over the Phoenix metro area. Local TV news picked up the story, and I found myself being interviewed on my front lawn by reporters from 3 different stations. Through all of this, Brenda Patterson remained defiant. In a statement to the Arizona Republic, she said, "The Sagebrush Hills HOA maintains the highest standards for our community, and we make no apologies for enforcing our covenants. Mr. Walters and others who choose to violate community standards should expect consequences." The statement made my blood boil, but Phil told me to ignore it. "She's digging her own grave," he said. "Every public statement like that just makes our case stronger." Our court date was set for 6 weeks out, but before we got there, something unexpected happened. I received an email from a man named Robert Zhang, who identified himself as a member of the Sagebrush Hills HOA Board of Directors. "Mr. Walters," the email read, "I want you to know that not everyone on the board supports how this situation has been handled. Several of us have been trying to rein in Miss Patterson for some time, but she has allies on the board who have blocked our efforts. Your lawsuit has finally given us the ammunition we need to force a change. We're calling an emergency board meeting next Tuesday, and I wanted to give you a heads up that there will likely be some significant developments." I forwarded the email to Phil, and we discussed whether I should attend the board meeting. Ultimately, we decided I should, just to observe. The meeting was held at the HOA office on a Tuesday evening. When I arrived, the small meeting room was packed. Word had gotten out, and at least 40 homeowners were crammed into a space designed for 20. I spotted Marcus and several other people I'd been in contact with. Brenda Patterson sat at the front table with 5 board members, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. The board president, a retired accountant named Donald Harper, called the meeting to order and immediately got down to business. "We're here tonight to discuss recent litigation against the association and to address concerns about our fine enforcement policies," he said, reading from a prepared statement. "The board has been reviewing the situation with Mr. Derek Walters and the fire hydrant violation, as well as several other recent enforcement actions." Brenda leaned forward to speak, but Donald held up a hand to stop her. "We've also retained an independent property surveyor to examine the fire hydrant in question. Their report, which was completed yesterday, confirms that the hydrant is located on HOA common area, not on Mr. Walters' property. Therefore, the fine issued to Mr. Walters was in error." A murmur went through the crowd. I felt vindication surge through me, but I kept my expression neutral. Donald continued, "Furthermore, our review has revealed that a significant number of fines issued over the past 3 years have been problematic. Some were for violations of rules that don't actually exist in our covenants. Others were issued without proper notice or opportunity to cure. And in many cases, additional penalties were added in retaliation for homeowners disputing the original fines." Brenda's face had gone pale. "Mr. President, I object to this characterization. Every fine I've issued has been in accordance with my duties as Community Standards Director." Robert Zhang, who I now recognized from his LinkedIn photo, spoke up. "Brenda, we have documentation of over 50 questionable fines in the past year alone. The association's attorney has advised us that we are significantly exposed legally, and that's before we even consider Mr. Walters' lawsuit." "I was doing my job," Brenda insisted, her voice rising. "This community was falling apart before I took over. People were painting their houses whatever colors they wanted, parking RVs in their driveways, letting their yards turn into deserts. I brought order and standards back." "You brought tyranny," someone shouted from the crowd. I turned and saw it was an elderly woman I recognized from a few streets over. Donald banged a gavel. "Order, please. This is not a public comment session." But the damage was done. Other homeowners started calling out, sharing stories of fines they'd received for minor infractions or things that weren't infractions at all. The meeting devolved into chaos, and Donald eventually had to call a recess. During the break, Robert Zhang approached me. "Mr. Walters, I want to apologize on behalf of the board. Most of us had no idea how bad things had gotten." Brenda reported directly to the board president, and she was very good at presenting information in a way that made her enforcement actions seem reasonable. "What happens now?" I asked. "We're going to vote on her termination tonight. But I'll be honest with you, she has 2 allies on the board who will vote to keep her. We need 4 votes out of 6 to terminate, and I'm not sure we have them." When the meeting reconvened, Donald moved to a vote on terminating the employment of Community Standards Director Brenda Patterson, effective immediately. Robert seconded the motion. The debate that followed was heated. 2 board members, a woman named Susan Creamer and a man named Todd Peterson, defended Brenda vigorously. Susan argued that the community needed strong enforcement, and that backing down now would embolden violators. Todd claimed that the lawsuit was frivolous, and that the board would be making a mistake to give in to bullies. The irony of calling me a bully while defending Brenda was not lost on anyone in the room. Finally, Donald called for the vote. All in favor of terminating Miss Patterson's employment. 3 hands went up, Donald, Robert, and a woman named Lisa Mendez. Opposed, 2 hands, Susan and Todd. The motion fails 3-2, Donald said heavily. We needed 4 votes. There was an outcry from the crowd. People were shouting, some standing up. Brenda sat with a small, satisfied look on her face. But then the 6th board member, a quiet man named Patrick Sullivan who hadn't said anything all evening, raised his hand. Mr. President, I'd like to propose an alternative motion. Donald looked surprised. Go ahead, Patrick. I move that we place Brenda Patterson on immediate administrative leave pending a complete independent audit of all fines issued in the past 3 years. The audit will be conducted by an outside firm, and any fines found to be improper will be refunded. During the leave period, Miss Patterson will have no authority to issue violations or interact with homeowners. I'll second that, Robert said quickly. This time, when the vote came, it was 5-1 in favor, with only Susan voting against it. Todd had switched sides, apparently seeing the political wind shifting. Brenda stood up abruptly, her face flushed. This is outrageous. You're bowing to pressure from people who want to turn this community into a slum. Sit down, Brenda, Donald said firmly. You're on leave as of now. Please collect your personal items and leave the premises. I'll sue, Brenda threatened. I'll sue the board, the association, and every single person who's been part of this witch hunt. That's your right, Donald said. But for now, you need to leave. Brenda grabbed her purse and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The room erupted in applause. Over the next few weeks, things moved quickly. The board hired an accounting firm to audit the fines, and the results were even worse than anyone had expected. Out of nearly 300 fines issued in the past 3 years, over 200 were found to be either completely improper or excessively harsh. The total amount of questionable fines was over $150,000. The board voted to refund all improper fines and to dismiss all pending liens. They also voted to terminate Brenda Patterson for cause, citing the audit findings. This time the vote was unanimous, with even Susan and Todd recognizing that the evidence was overwhelming. But the story didn't end there. When the Arizona Republic published a follow-up article about the audit results, it caught the attention of the Arizona Attorney General's office. An investigator contacted me and several other homeowners, asking detailed questions about how the fines had been assessed and where the money had gone. It turned out that Brenda had been doing more than just over-enforcing HOA rules. The investigation revealed that she'd set up a separate consulting company that she'd hired to do compliance inspections for the HOA. She was essentially paying herself with HOA funds, and the board hadn't caught it because she'd buried the expense in the budget under professional services. Over the 3 years she'd been Community Standards Director, she'd funneled over $90,000 to her own company for these fake inspections. It was fraud, plain and simple. The Attorney General's office brought criminal charges against Brenda Patterson for theft, fraud, and embezzlement. The case made headlines across Arizona, and Brenda became the poster child for HOA abuse. My lawsuit settled before trial. The HOA agreed to pay all my attorney's fees, issue a formal apology, and implement new policies limiting how fines could be assessed. They also agreed to settle with all the other homeowners who'd been improperly fined, creating a fund of over $200,000 for refunds and compensation. Phil made sure the settlement included strong reforms. Going forward, Any fine over $100 required board approval, not just the decision of a single standards director. Homeowners had to be given 30 days' notice and a chance to correct violations before any fine was assessed. And most importantly, any homeowner who disputed a fine got an automatic hearing before the full board, not just the standards director. The criminal case against Brenda took longer. Her attorney tried to argue that the payments to her consulting company were legitimate, but the evidence was overwhelming. She'd billed for inspections that never happened, charged for services that were already covered under her employment contract, and deliberately hidden the payments from the board. 18 months after this all started, I sat in a Maricopa County courtroom and watched as Brenda Patterson was sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA. The judge was particularly harsh in his comments. "Miss Patterson, you were in a position of trust, responsible for maintaining standards in a community where people had invested their life savings in their homes. Instead of serving that community, you used your position to enrich yourself and to bully and intimidate homeowners who questioned your authority. Your actions have caused significant financial and emotional harm to dozens of families. This court finds that a substantial prison sentence is warranted." Brenda showed no emotion as she was led away in handcuffs. I felt a complex mix of satisfaction and sadness watching her go. Part of me felt vindicated, but another part just felt tired. This had consumed nearly 2 years of my life, and while we'd won, the victory felt hollow in some ways. But as I left the courthouse, I ran into Marcus Chen and several other homeowners who'd been part of the lawsuit. We decided to grab lunch together, and as we sat in a downtown Phoenix restaurant, the mood was celebratory. "You know what the best part is?" Marcus said, raising his glass. "The new community standards director they hired is actually reasonable. I talked to her last week about wanting to put up a new fence, and she actually helped me figure out how to do it within the covenant rules instead of just looking for reasons to fine me." "That's the thing," I said. HOAs aren't inherently bad. They serve a purpose in maintaining property values and community standards. But they need oversight, and they need to be run by people who see themselves as serving the community, not ruling over it. Lisa Mendez, who'd become a friend through all of this and had been elected the new HOA board president, nodded. "We're trying to change the whole culture of the association. Yes, we need rules, but we also need flexibility and common sense. And we need to remember that we're all neighbors, not adversaries." As we finished lunch and went our separate ways, I walked back to where I'd parked my car and found myself taking a detour past the spot where this had all started. The fire hydrant stood there, bright red and freshly painted, on the strip of common area between properties. Someone had planted flowers around its base, turning what had been a source of conflict into something almost decorative. I pulled out my phone and took a picture, then sent it to Phil with a caption, "Ground Zero, thanks for everything." His response came back a minute later. "Pleasure was mine, don't get into any more HOA disputes." I laughed and texted back, "No promises." Driving home that evening, I thought about everything that had happened. What had started as a simple dispute over an incorrectly issued fine had mushroomed into a major case of fraud and abuse. But it had also led to real change, not just for me but for everyone in Sagebrush Hills and hopefully for homeowners in other communities who'd been following the case. The Arizona legislature had even passed new laws strengthening homeowner protections against HOA overreach, largely in response to the publicity our case had generated. The laws required more transparency in how fines were assessed, gave homeowners better appeal rights, and imposed criminal penalties for HOA officials who engaged in fraud or self-dealing. When I got home, I found a letter in my mailbox. Not an orange violation notice this time, but a regular white envelope from the HOA. Inside was a formal invitation to the annual homeowners meeting, where they'd be voting on proposed covenant amendments designed to prevent another Brenda Patterson situation. I marked the date on my calendar. After everything I'd been through, I figured I had a responsibility to stay engaged and make sure the reforms we'd fought for actually stuck. 3 months later, on a Saturday evening, the annual meeting took place in the community center. The turnout was the largest in Sagebrush Hills history, with over 200 homeowners attending in person and another 100 joining via video conference. Lisa ran the meeting efficiently, and the covenant amendments passed with over 90% approval. After the formal business concluded, Lisa asked me to say a few words. I hadn't prepared anything, so I spoke from the heart. 2 years ago, I opened my door and found a violation notice for a fire hydrant that wasn't even on my property. I was angry and frustrated, and I decided to fight back. At the time, I thought it was just about me and a stupid $500 fine, but it turned out to be about a lot more than that. I looked around the room at faces that had become familiar over the past 2 years. We learned that silence in the face of injustice just enables more injustice. We learned that standing up for yourself means standing up for your neighbors too. And we learned that even the most powerful bully can be held accountable if enough people are willing to say no, this isn't right. The reforms we've put in place aren't just words on paper. They represent a commitment to treating each other with respect and fairness, to remembering that we're a community, not subjects of some petty kingdom. I want to thank everyone who stood with me, everyone who shared their stories, and everyone who's committed to making sure this never happens again. The applause was genuine and warm. After the meeting, dozens of people came up to shake my hand and thank me, but the person whose thanks meant the most came from an unexpected source. An elderly woman I didn't recognize approached me as I was getting ready to leave. "Mr. Walters." "I'm Dorothy Simmons. I live over on Cactus Way." "Nice to meet you, Dorothy." "I wanted to thank you," she said, her eyes glistening. 3 years ago, Brenda Patterson fined me for having a memorial bench in my front yard. My husband had just passed away, and I'd put out a small bench under our tree where I could sit and feel close to him. She said it violated the outdoor furniture restrictions and fined me $500. When I explained about my husband, she just added another fine for emotional manipulation of HOA officials. I felt my jaw clench. "I'm so sorry." I paid the fines because I was scared, and I moved the bench to my backyard where no one could see it. I've been sitting back there alone for 3 years, feeling like I'd been bullied out of my own front yard. But last week, I moved the bench back where it belongs. And you know what? No one complained. In fact, my neighbor brought over flowers to plant around it. She took my hand in both of hers. "You gave me my home back. You gave all of us our homes back. Thank you." I hugged her, not trusting myself to speak. This, I realized, was what made everything worthwhile. Not the legal victory or the policy changes, but the real human impact on people who'd been made to feel powerless in their own homes. As I drove home that night, I passed the fire hydrant one more time. The flowers around its base had grown fuller, and someone had added a small plaque that read, "Sagebrush Hills Community Fire Safety Station, maintained with pride by your HOA." I smiled. Sometimes the best victories are the ones where everyone learns something and comes out better on the other side. Brenda Patterson had learned that abuse of power has consequences. The HOA board had learned that oversight and accountability matter, and the homeowners had learned that they had more power than they'd realized when they stood together. The situation had transformed from a nightmare into an opportunity for real positive change. The community was stronger, the rules were fairer, and people felt safe in their own homes again. That fire hydrant, which had been a symbol of overreach and bullying, had become a symbol of community cooperation and proper governance. Over the following months, I stayed active in HOA affairs, serving on a committee to review and update outdated covenant provisions. We removed dozens of overly restrictive rules and clarified language that had been used to justify questionable enforcement actions. The process was tedious but important, and I found myself actually enjoying the work of building something better. Other HOAs in the Phoenix area reached out, asking for advice on implementing similar reforms. Some invited me to speak at their meetings, and I shared our story as a cautionary tale and a roadmap for change. A few homeowners in other communities filed lawsuits inspired by our success, and several discovered their own cases of HOA officials engaged in fraud or self-dealing. The ripple effects of our case extended far beyond Sagebrush Hills. The Arizona Attorney General's office created a new HOA fraud task force, and the state legislature continued to pass homeowner protection laws. Real estate agents started including HOA governance information in their listings, warning buyers about communities with problematic enforcement histories. As for me, I settled back into normal life. My software development work kept me busy, and I dated a woman named Michelle Torres who thought the whole HOA battle story was alternately hilarious and horrifying. We'd met at a neighborhood barbecue that the new HOA board had organized, part of their effort to rebuild community spirit. On the 2-year anniversary of receiving that first violation notice, Phil called me out of the blue. "Derek, you're not going to believe this. What's up?" Remember Todd Peterson, that board member who initially defended Brenda? Yeah, the guy who switched his vote. He just got elected to the state legislature, and his first bill is a comprehensive HOA reform package. He's calling it the Homeowner Bill of Rights, and he's specifically citing our case as the inspiration. I sat back in my chair, amazed. Seriously. He wants you to testify when it comes up for committee hearings. I'll do it. The hearings took place 3 months later in the Arizona State Capitol building. I testified alongside several other homeowners who'd experienced HOA abuse, and our stories made a compelling case for reform. The bill passed with bipartisan support and was signed into law by the governor that summer. The new law required HOAs to carry liability insurance for wrongful fine enforcement, created a state ombudsman office to investigate homeowner complaints, and imposed significant penalties on HOA officials who engaged in retaliation or self-dealing. It wasn't perfect, but it was a major step forward in protecting homeowners' rights. Standing on the Capitol steps after the signing ceremony, I found myself reflecting on the journey. It had started with anger and frustration over an unjust fine, but it had led to meaningful systemic change that would protect thousands of homeowners for years to come. The personal had become political, and the political had become personal in the best possible way. Michelle joined me on the steps, slipping her hand into mine. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "Just thinking about how weird life is. 2 years ago, I was just a guy trying to get out of a bogus fine. Now I'm standing here watching the governor sign a law that grew out of that fight." "You should be proud," she said. "You didn't just complain about the system being broken, you actually fixed it." "We fixed it," I corrected. "None of this happens if it's just me." It took Phil fighting the legal battle, the other homeowners sharing their stories, the board members who were willing to stand up to Brenda, the reporters who covered the story, the legislators who turned it into law. It was a team effort. That's what makes it meaningful, Michelle said. Real change never comes from one person. It comes from communities of people who care enough to work together. We left the capital and drove back to Sagebrush Hills, where a celebration was taking place at the community center. The HOA had organized a party to mark the passage of the new law, and practically the whole neighborhood turned out. There was food, music, and a genuine sense of community that had been missing during the Brenda Patterson years. As the sun set over the desert, casting long shadows across the gathering, I found myself standing near that infamous fire hydrant again. Someone had added balloons to the flowers around its base, and kids were running around it playing some kind of game. Marcus came up beside me holding a plate of food, thinking about where it all started. "Yeah," I said. "Who knew a fire hydrant could change so much?" "It wasn't the hydrant," Marcus said. "It was you deciding to stand up." The hydrant was just the excuse Brenda needed to reveal who she really was. You could have paid the fine and moved on. Most people did. But you fought back, and that made all the difference. "I almost didn't," I admitted. The first few days, I kept thinking maybe I should just pay it and avoid the hassle. $500 wasn't worth the stress of a big legal fight. But it wasn't about the money. No, I agreed. It wasn't. It was about the principle. About not letting someone abuse their authority just because they think they can get away with it. Dorothy Simmons walked over, moving slowly with her cane. She'd become a friend over the past 2 years, and I'd helped her plant more flowers around her husband's memorial bench. "Are you boys talking philosophy again?" she asked with a smile. "Just reminiscing," I said. "Well, come eat something before all the good food is gone. You've earned it." The party went on into the evening, and as I looked around at my neighbors laughing, talking, and genuinely enjoying each other's company, I realized that this was the real victory. Not the lawsuits or the legislation or even Brenda's conviction, but this. A community that felt like a community again, where people weren't afraid of their own HOA, where fairness and common sense prevailed over petty tyranny. The fire hydrant still stood at the corner of my property line, 2 feet outside the boundary, exactly where it had always been. But now, it represented something different. Not a tool of oppression or an excuse for unjust fines, but simply what it was meant to be. A piece of safety equipment maintained by the community for the community. And that, I thought as I joined Michelle and my neighbors at the celebration, was exactly how it should be. The months that followed brought a return to normalcy, but with a heightened sense of civic awareness. I'd learned that you can't just assume the systems and institutions around you will function fairly. They require active participation and vigilance from the people they're meant to serve. When good people disengage, bad actors fill the void. I stayed on the HOA governance committee and helped train the new community standards coordinator, a reasonable woman named Patricia Chen, who saw her job as helping homeowners comply with rules, not looking for reasons to fine them. Under her guidance, violation notices dropped by 80%, but actual compliance with important rules improved. It turned out that education and cooperation worked better than threats and punishment. The civil restitution from Brenda's criminal case provided funds for community improvements. The board held a vote, and residents decided to use the money for a new playground, better landscaping in common areas, and a small community garden where people like Dorothy could grow flowers and vegetables together. On a warm April morning, about 3 years after that first violation notice, I attended the grand opening of the community garden. It was built on a piece of common area that had previously been neglected, and it had brought neighbors together in ways the HOA had never managed during its enforcement-heavy years. As I helped Dorothy plant tomatoes in her assigned plot, I noticed the fire hydrant was visible from where we worked, standing guard at the edge of the garden area. It had been repainted again recently, bright red and gleaming in the Arizona sunshine. "You ever think about that hydrant?" Dorothy asked, following my gaze. "Sometimes," I admitted. "Mostly I think about how lucky we were that everything worked out the way it did." "Luck had nothing to do with it," Dorothy said firmly. "You made a choice to fight for what was right, and that choice inspired others to do the same." "That's not luck. That's courage." I didn't feel particularly courageous. I'd just been angry about an unjust fine and stubborn enough not to back down. But I'd learned that sometimes courage doesn't look like bravery in the dramatic sense. Sometimes it just looks like ordinary people refusing to accept injustice, even when it would be easier to give in. The garden flourished that summer, becoming a hub of community activity. People who'd barely spoken to each other before worked side by side, sharing gardening tips and produce. The HOA organized monthly potlucks featuring vegetables from the garden, and attendance rivaled the turnout at the annual meeting. One evening in July, as I was watering my section of the garden, a young couple I didn't recognize approached me. They looked to be in their late 20s, and the woman was holding a folder of papers. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you Derek Walters?" "I am." "I'm Jennifer Patel, and this is my husband Raj. We just bought a house here in Sagebrush Hills." During the closing process, our real estate agent told us about what happened with you and the HOA, and how things have changed. "That's actually one of the reasons we chose this community. We wanted to live somewhere with an HOA that actually functioned properly." "Welcome to the neighborhood," I said, shaking their hands. "We were wondering," Raj said, "if you had any advice for new homeowners about how to stay engaged with the HOA and make sure what happened before doesn't happen again." It was a good question, and I thought about it carefully before answering. The most important thing is to pay attention and participate. Go to the board meetings even when they're boring. Read the minutes. Vote in elections. And if you see something that doesn't seem right, speak up. Don't assume someone else will handle it. "That's what we figured," Jennifer said. "We're both going to the next board meeting." As they walked away to look at the rest of the garden, I felt a sense of optimism about the future. The next generation of homeowners understood that community governance required active participation, not passive acceptance. The lessons we'd learned were being passed forward. Michelle joined me at the garden as the sun began to set, and we sat on one of the benches that had been installed along the pathways. From where we sat, we could see the fire hydrant, Dorothy's memorial bench, the new playground, and the houses of Sagebrush Hills stretching out under the desert sky. "You know what's funny?" Michelle said. "This whole thing started because the HOA was wrong about a property line. But in trying to enforce that wrong decision, they exposed all these other problems that led to real change. Sometimes the worst mistakes lead to the best outcomes." "I guess that's true," I said, although I could have done without the stress of a 2-year legal battle. "But you'd do it again, wouldn't you?" "If you had to," I thought about it and realized she was right. "Yeah, I would. Because the alternative is letting people like Brenda Patterson win, and that's not acceptable." We sat in comfortable silence as the evening cooled and other neighbors drifted into the garden, some to water their plots, others just to enjoy the peaceful space. This, I realized, was what an HOA was supposed to create. Not uniformity enforced through fear, but community built through cooperation and mutual respect. The fire hydrant stood sentinel over it all, no longer a symbol of conflict but simply a part of the landscape, serving its intended purpose without drama or controversy. It had returned to being what it always should have been: a piece of infrastructure, properly maintained by the entity responsible for it, protecting everyone in the community equally. As darkness fell and we walked home, I glanced back one more time at that red hydrant, and I smiled. Sometimes the smallest things lead to the biggest changes, and sometimes standing your ground over something as simple as a property line measurement can transform an entire community. The story of the fire hydrant fine would become part of Sagebrush Hill's history, a cautionary tale told to new residents about what happens when HOAs lose sight of their purpose. But more than that, it became a reminder that ordinary people have extraordinary power when they refuse to accept injustice and work together for change. And that, ultimately, was the real lesson of the fire hydrant. Not that HOAs are inherently bad or that homeowners are powerless, but that good governance requires engagement, accountability, and the courage to stand up when something isn't right. Those principles applied far beyond HOA disputes, extending to every level of civic life. Years would pass, and the details of the dispute would fade in people's memories. But the culture change it sparked would endure, creating a community where people felt empowered rather than intimidated, where rules served the residents rather than controlling them, and where a fire hydrant could just be a fire hydrant, nothing more and nothing less. That was the victory worth celebrating, and it had all started with a simple refusal to pay an unjust fine for a fire hydrant that wasn't even on my property.